and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits. Red Garland was a very influential pianist of his generation. His style was a blend of other leading pianists of his time like Nat King Cole, Bud Powell and Ahmad Jamal. He started out as a clarinet player and saxophonist. Then when he was 18, he switched to piano. During the late 40s and early 50s, he toured and performed alongside names like Charlie Parker, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young and others. He shot to fame working alongside the Miles Davis Quintet from 1955 to 58, leading a rhythm section that comprised of himself, Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones. He then started out leading a trio of his own and produced notable albums of his own. His technique on piano block chords became widely popular among his peers. Block chords is a technique that incorporates playing all the notes within an octave simultaneously to create a specific harmonized line. So that was some insight into Red Garland, his biography and best hits. More details coming up. Also coming up, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva to find out more. We'll be right back after some music. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. So, Red Garland was a self-taught artist who saw fame in the 50s, playing alongside some of the leading jazz musicians of his era. He rose to fame with Miles Davis during the 50s. He went on to lead his own ensembles before retiring in 1968. He then returned to the music scene in 1976 and went on performing. He was also a pioneer of a special type of piano playing technique that found wide popularity among his peers. So Garland was born on March 13, 1923 in Texas. He started out studying clarinet playing alongside Buster Smith, who was also a big influence on Charlie Parker in his early years. Buster was a well-known Texas saxophonist. He developed an interest in piano playing after hearing a pianist called John Lewis performing at a concert in Arizona in 1941. He asked John Lewis to mentor him in piano playing. In 1945, Red Garland performed for the very first time alongside Bill Blocker in a public gig. They toured and performed at concerts across the country. After that, Garland started out solo, performing in clubs. He then had a stint with Billy Eckstine's band. He would tour and perform in clubs during his stint with Eckstine, also collaborated with players like Bud Powell and Art Tatum during that time. In 1953, he joined Miles Davis, who was starting out with a trio of his own. The group opened up with a performance in Baltimore and starred Red Garland on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, and John Coltrane on saxophone. Miles Davis was on trumpet. Red Garland's piano style was perfect for the group. He was the anchor for the playing of the other band members. After leaving Miles Davis' band, he went on performing solo. His music was typically centered around jazz classics, show tunes, and blues and bebop melodies. Some of his best albums released during that time included Soul Junction, All Morning Long, Dig It, At the Prelude, and more. He also became famous for his piano block chord technique, which inspired several other pianists of his generation. In a block chord style, both hands sound every note of the melody. In Garland style, the right hand plays octaves and fifth notes during a block chord. This technique allows for very dynamic piano playing and is great for solo performances. Other pianists who had similar block chord techniques included George Shearing and Bill Evans. Red Garland died in 1984, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most brilliant pianists of his time. Critics have described his piano playing to that of a painter painting a beautiful work of art. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending album news. So, 3 Below is an up-and-coming jazz band featuring Michael Manring and Trey Gunn on guitar. Time Out magazine calls them musicians with enormous talent and giant careers. Their latest release was recorded in Mexico and it's called Live in Merida. So, there's also a special guest appearance on the album by Emmanuel Pina on the oud. That's a type of stringed instrument. The story of 3 Below began during a journey to Mali, when Ariola and Gunn were traveling across West Africa in 2012. They were trying to connect with the locals using their musical instruments. They would tour and perform with them, participating in jam sessions and late-night festivals. So the backdrop of traditional musical experiences gained in Mali set the foundation of the band 3 Below. Bass legend Michael Manring joined a few years later. Manring's a brilliant soloist and ensemble performer. 3 Below started out giving out live performances in Mexico. Their concerts typically feature Latin American, Asian, African and European music, with Ariola and Gunn on the ukulele and the acoustic bass. The second half of the concert features Gunn and Manring soloing on electric instruments. So they've just released a brand new album called Live in Merida, featuring tracks like Hard Wings, Forest Flow, Lake of Ice and more. For more information, please visit 3belowband.com. And that's some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Red Garland's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. The first album is called Soul Junction, released in 1960. This one's a classic straight-ahead hard bop jazz album from the 60s, a beautiful marathon of blues hits by the Red Garland Quintet. There's 4 original songs by Garland, featuring John Coltrane, Donald Byrd, Red Garland, Art Taylor and George Joyner. Coltrane's one of the highlights with his solo playing. Another album called All Morning Long. Garland is joined by Donald Byrd and John Coltrane on these songs. Donald was still starting out at the time of this recording and he's very innovative even back then. A beautiful jam session giving us some great hard bop classics. And an album called A Garland of Red. There are 6 jazz classics on this album, on which Garland is joined by Paul Chambers on bass and Art Taylor on drums. And he takes us through some beautiful piano playing. There's also one of his own compositions here, Blue Red. A great swinging compilation of bebop tracks. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that, stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Soul Junction, released in 1960. This one's a beautiful marathon of blues hits by the Red Garland Quintet. There's 4 original songs by Garland. One of the features is the long-drawn saxophone and trumpet solos by John Coltrane and Donald Byrd. Also, there's some great bass and drums by Art Taylor and George Joyner. Coltrane's one of the highlights with his solo playing. There's great renditions of the song I've Got It Bad and Hallelujah. A beautiful partnership between Garland and Coltrane. Garland has a beautiful way of stretching out on his solo pieces. Also a feature of the album, Red Garland's chord technique, which really complements Coltrane's saxophone playing. He had a trademark way of voicing chords that play out beautifully on the solos. So this one's a classic straight-ahead hard bop jazz album from the 60s. All Morning Long is another great album. This one was recorded in 2 sessions in 1957 by the Red Garland Quintet. There's some very long pieces in the album, including the 20-minute All Morning Long and briefer covers of They Can't Take That Away From Me. Garland is joined by Donald Byrd and John Coltrane on the songs. Donald was still starting out at the time of this recording and he's very innovative even back then. Coltrane had already blazed a path with his saxophone prowess. A beautiful jam session giving us some great hard bop classics. One feature of the album is how Garland brings out the best in his entire ensemble with his playing. All Morning Long, for instance, a 20-minute track, Coltrane opens up with a dynamic solo. The rest of the players join in. Donald Byrd, whose bass is typically traditional, opts for some very unorthodox beats here. And then Red Garland joins in. His style is a blend of the avant-garde and the mainstream. That style went on to influence several other pianists to come from Gene Kelly to Monty Alexander to Ahmad Jamal. A Garland of Red is another great album. At the time of this recording, released in 1956, Garland was a mainstay at the Miles Davis Quintet, and this was his first record as band leader. He'd also perfected his unique style. There are 6 standards on which Garland is joined by Paul Chambers on bass and Art Taylor on drums, and he takes us through some beautiful piano playing. On the Charlie Parker classic Constellation, he shows us that he can sound relaxed while playing at lightning speeds. There's one of his own compositions here, Blue Red, one of his best recordings from the late 50s. A great swinging compilation of bebop tracks with Garland at his best on piano. Red Garland doesn't play much on piano on this album, it's mainly the rest of the band that take up the spotlight, but his playing is unique and beautiful. The solo performances are also very classy, crisp and light. So that was some insight into some of Red Garland's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Red Garland, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending contest news. So the 7th Virtual Jazz Club International Improvised Music Contest is now open for entries. This music contest is all about promoting musical talent around the world. This is the 11th edition of the annual jazz contest, and the deadline for entries is December 31st, 2024. The contest has been ongoing every year since 2016, with the vision and mission of the contest being to promote musical talent globally. Also, for participants under the age of 18, entry is free. This year's contest, there's 2 categories to participate in: the jazz category featuring swing, gospel, bebop, fusion, blues and more, and the beyond jazz category, which is for electro swing, pop jazz, hip hop, classic, country and more. So this contest is open to participants of all ages, with categories for under 18, under 30 and over 30 musicians. The contest is open to musical talent from all over the world. So to enter the contest, participants must submit a video of them performing a musical piece. Both original and non-original pieces are accepted. The entries will be evaluated by an expert team of judges featuring leading musicians, journalists and educators. The prize fund is €10.5. For more information, please visit 7virtualjazzclub.net. So that was some trending contest news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Red Garland's best hits of all time. Stay tuned.